Welcome back to Explored. Today we're going to be looking at downward facing dog, or in Sanskrit we call it Ardha Mukha Savasana. Now downward dog is a great pose for strengthening the upper body. So it works into the arms, the shoulders. It also builds strength in the core, the abdominal muscles and the legs. Now it stretches the whole back line of the body. So we're working from the back of the foot all the way up the leg, up the back into the neck. So it's a really great stretch for the calves, the hamstrings and the spine as well. Now downward facing dog is often used as either a rest pose, so we use it as a chance to catch your breath, just bring yourself back to your inhale and your exhale. It's also used as a pose to transition from the bottom of the mat or the back of the mat to the very front of the mat. It's a pose we use regularly, and sometimes when we use these poses over and over again, we can get a little bit sloppy with our alignment. So it's the same as like those forward folds into standing. Because we do them so many times, sometimes our brain switches off and we're not really thinking about what the body's doing. So it's always important that that first downward dog that you do, that you keep that integrity throughout the whole of your practice. So even if that means that you're there for an extra breath trying to set up the alignment, or you're just needing an extra second or a breath there to actually hold the pose, think about what you're doing, then take your time in the class to do it. You really want to make sure that we're building the strength in the correct area and making sure we're working those good movement patterns. So I previously said that sometimes downward dog is used as a resting pose. Now don't be fooled, downward dog is not an easy pose. There is so much going on. So we have the flexion of the wrists, dorsiflexion, as we're pressing the weight through our hands. We have the pronation of the arms, extension of the elbows, flexion in the shoulders, elevation of the scapula, so the shoulder blades, and then we've got all that weight that's going through the wrist and the hands. So there's an awful lot of stuff going on at the top part of our body. Now there can often be a lot of disconnection with people with their hands and their shoulders, not just in downward dog, but in a lot of poses that we come into. And this also is part of the fact that we're so forward flexion in a lot of our life, in our sedimentary life. So downward dog can sometimes feel very challenging. Now I'm just going to run through a few things that I see in class of where they might not be causing that person issues, but just remember, we always want to make sure that we're training the body correctly, getting into good movement patterns, as in habits, and we just want to make sure that we're not putting unnecessarily stress through those shoulders, through those wrists. So one thing that I often see in people's downward dogs is this section of the hand here. So for one, people tend to roll the hands out. So the fingertips aren't facing directly to the top of the mat, they're facing out towards the sides. Now that just, if you think about it, affects the rest of the arm. So if you can, you want to try and bring the fingertips in so they're facing towards the top of the mat. So it just helps keep the shoulders and the elbows in a nice, stable, structured line. Now this part of the hand is actually super key. Often people start rolling out, that's quite an exaggeration, but people roll that part of the hand off the floor. So then you're distributing the weight into your pinky edge of your finger. Your hands, you want to spread the fingers as wide as you possibly can. Press the fingertips down into the ground, make sure your pads the hands to the floor. So if you notice, it's almost like a gripping sensation that are going through my fingertips. It's like a suction cup. So by spreading the fingers, we're increasing the size of the area that we're distributing that weight. And then by pressing the fingertips down into the ground, almost clawing the hands into the floor, we're getting an extra bit of grip onto the hands as well. Now, bearing in mind, like a lot of alignment cues in yoga, they're not necessarily taking into consideration people's mobility or their structures or injuries. So if you are coming into downward dog with a few injuries, or you're just finding it hard to have this dorsiflexion position, what I want you to do is, yes, slowly turn your fingertips out, but just don't think about them taking them all the way out to the side. Slightly turn them, so think more 11 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and maybe even take your hands a little bit wider. I know there's going to be some yoga teachers out there that want to shoot me for saying that, but if you haven't got that mobility in the shoulders to bring the arms in line with the shoulders, so if that feels really uncomfortable for you, then definitely take your hands a little bit wider. You want to find a position where you feel super strong and supported, and where you can take that weight through those hands. When you come into your down dog, you want to think about making that upside down shape V with your body. In order to achieve that, you're pressing your heels down to the ground. Now, controversial, you do not need to have your heels touching the floor. So that all depends on that flexion of your ankles. But you do want to try and drive your weight through the feet so that we can stretch through the Achilles and the calves. You want to press your tailbone up towards the sky and you're using your hands to firm into the ground. Imagine you're trying to push the floor away from you, keep the shoulders away from the ears. One thing that I see quite a lot in class, in order for people to get length, they kind of flare their rib cage, push their chest between their arms, and they can take it into the lower back. So see now how I've come into extension in my lower part of my back, which means that it's really hard for me to engage my core here. My lumbar spine, the muscles that are supporting it, are really pretty much working super, super hard to keep me in this position. So when we're working to try and strengthen through the core, try and think about knitting your ribs towards your hips. Your chest doesn't need to go between your arms. Ears are in line with your shoulders. Now, another thing that I see is people like to really strain their neck. You don't need to look at your belly. You don't need to look at your knees. Ideally, you want to look down towards your toes and your ankles. Now, there is such thing as good tension that you can bring into the body, but by cranking your head up in this position, you're just going to take it into that C-section of the spine, and it's just not going to feel good. Eventually, over time, if you keep doing this over and over again in class, you're going to start bringing a lot of tension and tightness into those muscles, which you just don't want. Now, whilst we're here, it's really tempting, especially for people that are quite flexible, to lock those knee joints, to lock those elbows. You want to try and think about building strength here. So when you lock your joints, there's nothing wrong with that at all, but you are relying on your bones to keep you in that position. That doesn't mean that your muscles have switched off. It just means you're kind of relying on your bone structure as well as your muscles to stay here. Ideally, we really want to be working the muscles. So have a little bit of a micro bend in your elbows and your knees. And just make sure that we're building that strength in the legs and the arms. So another thing that I see is short down dogs. So this is often because people think their heels need to be flat to the floor. Now, like I just said then, your feet don't need to touch the ground. Ideally, you want to have your hands and your feet quite far away so you can naturally roll into plank. So if you're transitioning from plank to down dog, or down dog to plank to knees, chest, chin, or chaturanga, by having that distance set up with your hands and your feet, just means that you're then being able to move directly into the correct alignment to come into these positions. So let me show you. If you're ever unsure of whether your down dog is correct or not, start in a plank position, shoulders stacked over your wrist, press those heels away from you. Really simple, push your bum up towards the sky, find your down dog. So from here I can move forward, I can easily move into that chaturanga, and I can press myself back without having that really weird sort of constantly moving my feet. And again, the more we're moving in our down dog, moving our feet out, the more chances are that we're going to break that connection with the core and the lumbar spine is going to take it. So remember, for your perfect down dog, you want to make sure fingers are spread. Index fingers ideally spreading up towards the sky, the top of the mat. Hands in line with your shoulders. Unless that does not feel stable on your shoulders, then take your hands a little bit wider. Your gaze is between your toes and your ankles ideally. You're pressing your tailbone up but knitting the ribs down towards your hips so you've got a nice strong center. You're not locking your joints, and you've got a wide enough distance between your hands and your feet to move into plank. Now, if you're moving in a vinyasa class and someone's asking you to come in down dog, there is nothing wrong with you quickly rolling forward into plank, setting yourself up, and then pressing back into down dog. Remember, this is your practice. Make it suitable for you, your body, and just take your time with your movement. Now, there are a few modifications you can bring to your down dog. So if you do struggle with that weight bearing through your hands, what you can do, you can buy cork blocks, which kind of act like a wedge. It looks like a wedge of cheese that basically just takes the pressure from driving directly through the wrist. If you don't have one of those, you can use a folded up blanket or a towel like I've got here. And what you want to do is you want to place it so that the pad of the hand so that the wrists are slightly elevated. So instead of the weight going directly through into this main part of your hand, it's kind of spread further forward. So you could always come into this variation of a down dog. Just remember though, if you're coming into fast classes and stuff, if you're coming into like a power yoga flow, you definitely want to take your time a little bit slower just to set up your alignment. And if you are moving like a pace behind everyone else in class, it really doesn't matter as long as you're finding modifications that are helping your practice. Same thing can be done for your feet as well. If you do want to try and press your heels down to the floor, or you just want a little bit more of a stretch to assist you in doing so, what you can do is take a towel towards the back of the mat. Now I really want you to definitely take home the fact that your heels do not need to touch the floor. It doesn't mean that you've got a bad down dog if they're floating off the floor. But by having something underneath your feet and firmly pressing down into, that will help you release the Achilles and the calf, so the back of the leg. So sometimes that's quite nice to do in a class, and you can actually use a yoga block as well. If the modification for your hands is just not helping you whatsoever, and you need to take some time off, then maybe take some time off your practice, just really allow your body to recover. Or one option you could do is come into dolphin instead. So dolphin is where your forearms are down onto the ground, and you do want to make sure that to start with your elbows are directly underneath your shoulders and your hands are in line with elbows. So it's the same sort of setup with our upper body as Sphinx pose. Again, spread the fingers so you've got a nice distribution through your hands. Tuck the toes, take the legs up. Now this is your dolphin pose. So your upper body is like Sphinx, and you're wrapping the shoulders, pressing the palms, the forearms down into the ground, and then your bottom part of your body, your lower half, is like your down dog. So press the heels down, tailbone up, nice and strong in the core. So this is also a really good option for you to do if you want to take the weight bear off of those wrists. I hope you found that really useful. They're really simple, quick things that you can do that will make the world of difference with your down dog. It should enable you to feel a lot more stronger and a lot more supported in those positions too. So as always, give me some feedback, let me know how you get on with it, and let me know if it has made a difference to your dog. Thank you so much for joining me, and I can't wait to see you next time on Explored. So like every pose when it comes to yoga, it doesn't really take into considerations people's... Horse.
Bless you.
That cat's been in here. Okay. So I hope you found this class... So like a lot of yoga pose books...